The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University. This is EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy. Now, here's your host, Dr. Dan Sutter.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Socialism appeared to have been discarded into the trash heap of history after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the demise of the Soviet Union, and China's free market reforms. But many younger Americans view socialism as favorably as capitalism today, and the membership of the Democratic Socialists of America has more than doubled in the past 5 years. Opponents of socialism, which include the faculty of the Johnson Center, often raise the millions of persons who were killed under communism in the 20th century as a warning to would-be socialists today. But is this history truly relevant to the debate over socialism in contemporary America? Answering this question involves examining what is meant by liberalism and then examining whether a truly liberal socialism is possible. Two of the greatest scholars of the 20th century, Friedrich Hayek and John Rawls, both weighed in on this question. Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss these issues is Dr. Kevin Vallier, a professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University, where he's also the director of the Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law program. Kevin studied philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis and then earned a PhD in philosophy at the University of Arizona. Kevin has authored or edited 8 books and has published over 40 papers in professional journals, including a recent paper critiquing John Rawls' theory of liberal socialism, which is part of what we'll be talking about today. Well, welcome back to the show, Kevin.
Thanks so much for having me back.
Well, let's start by talking about liberalism, because to sort of make sense of where the question we're addressing today, we need to know what was meant by liberalism in, I guess, what sometimes today we might refer to as a classical sense.
Sure. I understand the liberal tradition as having a kind of broad underlying unity that includes classical liberals but isn't limited to them. So I think of like 4 central values for the liberal is our political values, values that should be expressed in politics. And those are treating all as free, naturally free and equal. That is, no one is born the natural slave or servant of anyone else. So freedom and equality are basic liberal values. On top of that are the values of toleration and a harmony of interests. So the doctrine of toleration is that we try to look at diverse views in our own society and tolerate those that we dislike or disapprove of. Moreover, liberal orders often try to go further and to harmonize people's apparently conflicting interests, such as the interests between, say, capital and labor, or the interests between different social classes or groups. So that's, I think, what makes for a liberal broadly, someone who believes in freedom, equality, toleration, and a harmony of interests as their prime political values. Classical liberals tend to stress the importance of freedom from interference by government, an equality, say, of opportunity, but not of shares. They accept broad-based toleration, including of people who are conservative, morally conservative, or religiously conservative. And finally, they stress the harmony of interests provided for by the market, but de-emphasize it as it's found in democracy, democratic governance.
The toleration point, I think, is a really important one, because and I think that's one that has to be learned, both as us as individuals, and I think probably also as a society, because it's so natural for us to, think of children when they're playing. If a child wants to play with a toy and another kid has it, it's very natural to just go over and want to take it, and that maybe is your natural instinct, and you have to learn to respect and tolerate others and recognize their equality with you, that the other child has as much desire to want to play with their toys as you do.
Yeah. No, I think that's important. And it's also important in the way that it manifests in institutions. So the way in which we have institutions that allow us not to interfere with one another, at least, or not to control and dominate, these include, I think, most importantly, constitutional rights. So that each person has their own space to live their own lives in their own way. democratic governance for those issues where we can't really resolve them, but we have to have a political solution. Markets where no political solution is required, and we can solve problems through cooperation and free exchange. And then the institution accepted by most liberals, including many classical liberals, of social safety nets in order to take out the really severe risks that come from life in the market, so that people have a kind of way to withdraw or to insulate themselves from the kind of unpredictable nature of markets, however good they are.
And when we sometimes want to refer to a nation as liberal, I mean, I guess we're referring to a pretty broad, that these values, these liberal values are pretty widely accepted, and then, like you say, I guess, instilled into some of the institutions and also history and traditions of a country as well, right?
Yes, I mean, so what's important here is not that everyone is sort of interested only in their own personal autonomy, that all they care about is their own freedom, that they don't try to serve any higher and nobler causes, that they never put themselves under any hierarchies voluntarily. It doesn't mean any of that. Rather, it means that people accept certain values as political values, overarching values that should shape what government does, but doesn't necessarily give a whole plan of life for individuals. So, you can have religiously conservative liberals who support the political values and who support liberal democratic capitalism. So it's very important to understand, I think, that liberalism is not a kind of personal ethos. It is not a complete philosophy of life.
And when we talk about where liberalism arose, I mean, it was sort of like in England and maybe Northwestern Europe, and certainly was transplanted to the American colonies and helped shape the founding, right?
Yes, although I do think liberalism was actually a pretty small group of philosophers, economists, and so on, really until the 19th century. I mean, there are a lot of people being influential with liberal ideals, but they're often coming at them from very, very different directions than we ordinarily think. For instance, Calvinist theology, which is, Reformed theology, that was very, very important in the preconditions for, say, British or Dutch or American liberal communities. But they came in a very different route, and they sort of weren't necessarily tolerant in the ways that we would ordinarily associate with liberalism. I'm not trying to emphasize that liberalism is the sort of new kid on the block that could be dismissed, just to sort of give a fuller picture of the way in which I think certain liberal ideals and practices arose, particularly out of Protestant Christianity.
And so then, when we think about some of the horrors of communism, or I know there's a new museum, I think, in Washington called the Victims of Communism Museum. One immediate reaction to that was that, like, Russia and China were not what we would have called at the start of the 20th century liberal nations. There was no real liberal tradition in Russia. It had been ruled by the Tsar, and they still had serfs, and they certainly didn't have some of those same liberal traditions as Britain had.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been learning a little bit lately about liberal movements in Russia, which did exist, but it's certainly the case that Russian institutions never approximated liberalism to the extent that we saw in Western Europe, not even close in many cases. And so what you have are, essentially feudal institutions that are seen as oppressive and stultifying, but instead of liberalism getting there through certain kinds of reforms, the gradual limitation of aristocratic privilege, the establishment of the rule of law and constitutional governance, and democratic voting and party voting, you instead saw this kind of this communist revolution that rejected many of the values that liberals hold dear. They rejected toleration. They were a state-imposed atheist state. They rigidly persecuted religion. And they certainly rejected the harmony of interests because they thought that the capitalist class had to be liquidated. And indeed, they did liquidate them. And so what you had was essentially sort of feudal societies, or China's a little bit more complicated and developed than the Russian case, that leapt immediately towards a kind of illiberal socialism. So, yes.
And so then, it's always tricky at some point to say, what countries you want to say have experimented with socialism. But, Britain, after World War II, for 30 or 35 years, between about 1946 and 1979 under their labor governments. I don't know if I guess you could make a claim that they experimented with socialism. They certainly had a fairly wide government ownership of some of the important industries, and in addition to creating the National Health Service. But we didn't see socialism degenerate in Britain as it did with communism in Russia or China.
Sure. I mean, it's important to distinguish between kind of dictatorial socialism and democratic socialism. I mean, even if socialism is illiberal, such as with its treatment of religion, you can have a parliamentary democratic socialism, a kind of gradualist reformist socialism, or sometimes called Fabian socialism, or you can have the kind of revolutionary Marxist socialism. And while Britain had a number of Marxists, they never really had a successful Marxist movement. The Labour Party was a kind of democratic socialist movement that was indeed attempting to be liberal in some respects. The UK got to the point where maybe about 25% of the means of production were publicly owned, but they never got anywhere near close to the Labour ideal of a society where capital is publicly owned and managed and monitored and planned. So while I think they attempted it, they got about a quarter of the way there. And then there were forces that led them to go in a different direction. And I think there's some systematic reasons for that. It's really remarkable when you think about it. There's never been a democratic people that has chosen to be classically liberal, but it's also the case that there's no democratic people that's ever chosen socialism in any kind of long-term or permanent way. It looks like when you let most people vote, you get some variations of social control between markets and the welfare state. That most publics seem to buy certain mixes. So yeah, it's very important that democratic socialism never got anywhere close to its goals. There was just too much disagreement and diversity, and that's going to matter for later in the conversation. So
we'll get back to that point, but that's just I guess a little bit of a preview.
Yeah.
Then let's talk a little bit more about then what would be involved with like the notion of liberal socialism, because you have a paper where you talk about to what extent it's not possible, or there are some internal contradictions with it. But before we can get to the contradictions, I think we need to understand what is involved when you think about people in the liberal tradition also sort of trying to embrace some elements of socialism.
Yeah, so I mean, most of the liberal tradition since the late 19th century has moved in the direction of taking on some insights from socialism, but not really getting anywhere near close to all the way there. Even the early 20th century liberals were saying, yeah, there's got to be private property and capital. So what it would be to have liberal socialism, as many people conceived of it, is that you would combine liberal constitutional rights, parliamentary democratic government, with the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production, at least outside of small business. And so the idea is that the government would own and operate the commanding heights of the economy, the big sources of capital, and it would plan them in accord with the benefit of all under equal terms. So that's really what liberal socialism was envisioned to be. And there were a lot of people that thought that was the way to go.
And one way to sort of make sense of this, because as somebody coming from the outside, I would normally think, well, property rights have to be extremely important, and socialism starts intruding on people's property rights. But in some liberal conceptions, property rights don't have the same primacy, I think, as some free market economists might want to try to place on them.
That's right. Although even John Rawls, who was open to liberal socialism or a related but less socialist economic form known as property owning democracy, not Thatcher's sense, they're very different. Even he thought that basic liberal rights included a right to personal property and a right to freedom of occupation. So even Rawls thought the government can't choose your job for you. And I also think that it includes the right to own your own home. So liberals, Rawls's liberal socialism would have included protecting those two kinds of property rights. So yeah, property is going to be important. It's property and productive resources is where the dispute is. Who should own the goods that make other goods?
And then I guess particularly you could look at like the large corporations or the banks that are allocating capital in the economy. Those are the places where you can say, like, well, maybe you have the government run that, but you can have some other forms of private property. And that private property helps people realize their own selves, their self-actualizations. People be able to structure their lives.
This is all true, but these are
Yeah.
I mean, and these are all true, but they're all things that the liberal socialist denies. I mean, they think that if you don't have socialism, all these forms of ossification, class rule, inequality, domination, a lack of growth and creativity among the working classes, all of these things are going to be widespread. Now, of course, I'm just telling you what I think they hold. I hold something closer to the opposite, but nonetheless, I think that's what they would say.
Now, one of the great critics of socialism in the 20th century was Friedrich Hayek, and in particular his very well-known book, The Road to Serfdom. And in that book, he lays out an argument that certainly us modern free market economists like to repeat very frequently. And he made an argument about how it was that the worst tend to get on top in socialism. And so that is, in some sense, a very important challenge to any idea of liberal socialism, or socialism that's not going to go to the totalitarian length. So tell us, if you can, a little bit about Hayek's point here.
Well, actually, I think Hayek has a number of points against liberal socialism. One is just looking at the kind of reality of, if you concentrate a great deal of power, that you're going to get bad people running the show. And that at least with markets, even if you have large concentrations of capital, they can come and go, and you can still avoid monopoly. And so Hayek's going to think, look, if you centralize things in the way that socialism does, you're going to have bad rulers. But Hayek also said, even if you had good rulers, they couldn't solve the relevant problems, because there were computational problems that couldn't be solved, which is how to determine exchange rates between goods and services without private property and the means of production. So the difficulty is that you don't have any group that can collect all the economic, I'm just telling you as you know, of course, but collect all the economic knowledge that's necessary to actually carry out planning the economy. That essentially a private property system is a kind of bottom-up system of social cognition, a system that's much, much more intelligent than any small group of planners imposing their will from the top down. And the result, I think, will inevitably not just lower productivity, but a massively intrusive government that's constantly organizing, poking, prodding people, and almost always producing disappointing results. So there's a lack of freedom there, and the tendency to tinker and control, combined with bad leaders at the top, means that you can expect the system to gradually degrade into something more like Marxist socialism, or else the society takes a different turn and moves away from liberal socialism, which is basically what all liberal orders did, like basically all of them.
Because I mean, when I read Hayek, he's not denying the possibility that there could be some very good people, wanting to be, who are socialists and ascribe to some of these democratic and liberal values, but at some point, as you say, and part of it's due to some of the inherent economic contradictions of socialism, they're going to end up debating, and they sort of can't close debate amongst themselves, and so it looks like they're just piddling around and not getting around to making the
they
important.
They look petty and small.
Pardon? Yeah.
It looks like yeah.
Yeah, and then I guess the other part of it that I see in there, that liberalism always involves tolerance, and that's a learned value, and when you're disagreeing with people and you're already aggregating a lot of power in the state, it's really kind of hard to say, okay, you can order people around like in the economic sphere, but then you're not supposed to order them around like in the political sphere.
Yeah, I think in my article, there's an important analogy here between liberals like Rawls, who say, well, look, people are going to reasonably disagree about religion, and that means the state can't successfully or rightly impose a religion on everyone. It would violate people's freedom and equality. It would undermine the harmony of interests. It would be intolerant. But moreover, it would destabilize the entire order, because there's a huge number of people that couldn't be on board with it and accept it on moral terms. The only stability that one could arrive at is one that was imposed by violence or force. And in my article, I make the argument that the same is true of the kinds of economic planning that liberal socialism would require. So, think about imposing a religion that speaks to all elements of life, like Catholicism or Islam. where there's detailed art, architecture, moral values, theology books, a clerical class, and so on and so forth. Imposing a particular religion would involve an enormous amount of interference, and there'd be a great amount of resistance from people who are constantly being tinkered with. And I see liberal socialism as running into the same problem because it has to impose certain economic plans that do something very, very much like this. They don't necessarily poke and prod people in matters of faith, but they poke and prod people in matters of their own private economic lives, constantly adjusting, readjusting, regulating, deregulating, re-regulating, taxing. And so the result is going to be a destabilization of a liberal order that is socialist, such that it's going to have to go in one of two directions. It's either going to have to retreat from socialism and do something more like most countries do now, or liberal democratic welfare state capitalism, or it's going to have to abandon liberalism. And indeed, this was, a lot of people say that Hayek exaggerated the threat of socialism. And I think they often misrepresent his argument. But I think his argument was essentially that the principles of liberalism and socialism could not be successfully combined in reality. And I think that reality bears him out. The mere fact that there are these Scandinavian nations, they redistribute a great deal of wealth, but they don't actually tinker with markets very much. And so what you see is, I think, a vindication of Hayek's thesis, because every society that went socialism, that went full socialist, rejected liberalism, and every liberal society rejected full socialism.
And that's a good point you bring about the Scandinavian countries, because the measures of economic freedom that economists have developed and that we use show that, other than on the size of government, the element of the size of government, they actually have a very good, they actually are very quite pro-free market. I mean, more free market than the United States. One thing they do is they do have high taxes, and they do redistribute a lot of money, but they are sort of respecting people's rights to earn the money, but then you can tax it, and you are allowing markets to function in many ways there.
The other thing that a lot of people don't understand about these countries is, as a friend of mine, a Swedish economist, said, we redistribute from the top 90% to the bottom 90%. So almost all the redistribution in Sweden is just moving money within a certain person's life, right? So, for savings programs and things, which they aren't the kind of take from the rich and give to the poor. The Scandinavian countries think generally everyone has to have buy-in to these programs for them to work well. So almost everybody pays in, and almost everybody gets something out. So it's very different than what a lot of people have envisioned in terms of redistribution. So, in a sense, I think this is a little bit better arrangement from a classical liberal perspective, and it's certainly not socialism or anything remotely approaching it. So,
some of the contradictions that you point out, and then, like I think where you can, as you allude to in Britain, when they were experimenting to some extent with socialism. Some of those also seem very reminiscent of what economist Ludwig von Mises talked about in terms of like a middle-of-the-road policy is well, he thought it was going to lead to socialism or government control, but there are inherent contradictions with these sort of middle-of-the-road policies where you try to have the government do some, make some important decisions in society and the economy, but not, take total command over people.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are some kinds of policies, particularly with the regulatory state, that kind of tend to snowball. I don't think there are as many of them as Mises thought. I think probably the better way to understand, or the way I would modify the argument, is to say if you look at the underlying principles that are used to justify middle-of-the-road policy, the only way to realize them is to move from middle-of-the-road to full-blown socialism. So it's not necessarily the case that there's this inevitable causal dynamic that once you intervene a few times in the economy, you're going to socialism inescapably or something like that. And I actually don't think that was Mises' view. I just think sometimes he was a little imprecise in his language. The idea is really more that, yes, the government might interfere with something at random, but that's not going to lead to socialism. But if the government starts to adopt as reasons of state these underlying egalitarian principles, then its attempts to realize them in middle of the road ways won't be satisfactory. And so we'll continue to have to push further and further. This is what Hayek was worried about when the Labor Party started talking about assigning people jobs, was that freedom of occupation was going to disappear. And there, even Rawls's liberal socialism would object. And so the idea is that the tinkering steamrolls because people are trying to realize principles that are incompatible with liberal freedom. That's what I would say.
So if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because I think it's a really fascinating aspect of Britain's experience, and with the Labour Party actually starting to, because there were some labor shortages, and I guess it was related to that, and the Labour Party sort of like almost getting up to the precipice or getting the recognition that they'd have to go a lot farther in order to try to make the economy work. So if you could tell us a little bit of that.
I mean, the striking thing is that, Hayek's in London as the war ends, and people are saying, look, what we did in war, we can do in peace, right? And Hayek is seeing, I think, that, oh, wow, the Labor Party is trying to do all of these different things, take over the economy, solve labor shortages, fix prices and wages, all kinds of different tactics that were being guided by people that were sincerely committed socialists, but who were reformist and democratic. So they were trying to get there gradually, like the Attlee government. And what they wanted to do, Hayek thought would invariably lead them to go further. And so, the society that the UK created acquired what was often called the British disease, and the richest economy in the world, basically. Didn't grind to a halt, but slowed down a great deal. And the result was that the people chose a conservative government that changed course in pretty big ways. So, yeah, I would say, there was about, as you said, about 30 years of experimentation with trying to realize socialist principles to various degrees, those causing all kinds of problems and dislocations and inefficiencies and controls. Hayek seeing these in the 40s. I mean, he's writing before the Second World War ends, but he's thinking about the sort of post-war era, thinking the Allies will win. Well, what's going to happen? What are the principles of social organization going to be? And I do think Hayek was right that the fundamental principles of socialism and liberalism are in tension, such that in reality, democratic peoples will have to choose between mostly liberalism and mostly socialism.
Well, that's very fascinating. So I mean, we're coming near the end of our time. So is there anything you'd like to add, or anything that we haven't covered that you think is important to the story?
Yeah, I think one thing it's important to do is to see the diversity in the liberal tradition, the ways in which it's tried to engage both conservatism and socialism and take on insights from it. The liberal tradition is very flexible. And a lot of your listeners, if they're younger, are encountering these kind of post-liberal or anti-liberal views. And they're coming to associate liberalism with something very, very specific that's oftentimes a caricature of the liberal tradition itself. It's a very broad range of liberal views. They vary a great deal over the last 200 years from one another. They do share the certain core that I outlined. But I think it's really important to actually read people like Hayek and to read people like Rawls to understand the sort of unity and diversity of the liberal tradition and the way that it engages other systems of thought, say religious systems of thought or socialist systems of thought. So, I've just been writing on my next book on this and trying to encourage writing to illiberal readers to see the diversity and unity of the liberal tradition altogether, and then to try to understand the ways that people have tried to draw on insights of other traditions like socialism, but have found that when they actually tried to do the mix, it didn't really work.
Well, yeah, and I think that's part of the. I think I do like this idea of the rich tradition of liberalism, and I think one of the things that has evolved over time is that people within the liberal traditions now have some very different ideas of what exactly freedom entails, and whether government and democratic government is necessarily coercive or not, and that's where somewhere today modern liberals and conservatives maybe disagree with each other. So. Well, thanks very much for coming on and talking about this. We enjoyed it very much. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks.
Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
This has been EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University.